Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm going to be speaking with sports psychologist Dr. Chris Mesagno. Chris, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Really excited to be speaking with you today. We're going to be talking all things choking in sports. Certainly a topic I know about all too well, as not just as a consulting sports psychologist, but also as a competing golf professional many years ago. A challenge I certainly faced. But let's start where we always start, Chris. Tell us a little bit about you and tell us a little bit about your work.
Yeah, so I'm Chris Mesagno. My work revolves around the idea of choking under pressure. And just a little bit of background from me. I'm a senior lecturer at Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia. But it's not exactly where I started. Some of you may hear the accent. Originally from Florida, started my education at the University of Florida. Go Gators! In Gainesville, Florida, and then after doing a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in exercise and sports science, I came over to Victoria University and finished a PhD in, let's not say the years, and then after that, finished that PhD up and worked at Federation University in Australia for 13 years, and now I'm back to where it all started in Australia at Victoria University. So that's my sort of educational journey, but my ideas and my suggestions all revolve around anxiety in sport and the idea of choking under pressure, which is where I do most of my research to date.
So have you exchanged baseball for cricket yet? Are you a big cricket fan yet? Have you bought into that sport yet?
I am a big sports fan, and I have slightly gotten into cricket every summer in Australia around Christmas time. I do watch some of the cricket.
Okay.
Although 5-day cricket matches, I'm just like, what is the point except for drinking beer and watching the cricket the entire time? Like, I can understand the beer drinking, but
Yes.
watching cricket for that long, I'm not necessarily sure. So the T20 stuff I get into,
Right.
where they cut it down to 20 overs or whatever, and then so I know a little bit about it now, but it's kind of like baseball. It tends to get boring after a little while.
Fair enough. And you said you're a big sports fan. I mean, what's your background in sport, Chris, and why sports psychology?
Yeah, so if I must, I played a number of sports when I was younger, tennis, golf, those types of things. But I was actually a collegiate 10-pin bowler
Really?
when I was in college at the University of Florida. That's right, and I'm actually in the Florida Youth Hall of Fame for 10-pin bowling. So it gives you a little bit of an indication of what my background is, and it's perfect for choking under pressure in sports psychology. It's kind of like golf. It's very much a mental sport when you get to a certain level,
Yep.
and that's how I got into sports psychology generally is just because I'm interested in the mental side of any sport and how people deal with issues, pressures, those types of things, and that's how I've gotten into it. So really, I played all kinds of sports when I was younger, but took up 10-pin bowling when I was like 10, and it was that was it. I still do it today. So and then on top of it, some of my research involves 10-pin bowlers as well. So there you go. Still working with them.
That's so good. I mean, we've not had a 10-pin bowler on the show yet, so you're the first. And I'm fascinated to unpack that a little bit because I really enjoyed 10-pin bowling when I was a kid, not to anywhere near the level that you played at. I remember one time starting with 3 strikes in a row and getting very excited about that and talking about the psychological side of things. Clearly got way ahead of myself because I became overly activated and I think it all went wrong from there. But I'm interested to find out when you were competing as a 10-pin bowler. I mean, obviously you were exceptional. Were you aware of the mental side of 10-pin bowling at all? Did you have any exposure to sports psychology?
Yeah, I didn't have when I was younger. I didn't have much exposure to sports psychology generally,
Yeah.
but obviously similar to golf, there's pressures that you sort of put on yourself and that sort of thing. And there were times when I probably I'll be the first one to admit the pressure got to me every once in a while, and sometimes I got lucky, and sometimes I didn't because of the pressures. So I always wanted to know why I was either susceptible to that anxiety or actually excelled. Sometimes, and as I knew mental toughness was a big thing generally, and I knew I had to be more mentally tough at some stages, and trying to push myself past those boundaries. That's how I sort of got into sports psychology, sort of knowing a little bit about how the difficulties that I might have had, and then also the positive side of things when I actually excelled as a result of those mistakes. I also, found that the mental side was important. So I was always reading books and, even bowling magazines. I would focus on the mental, the sports psychology side of the magazines and see how I went. So anything I could get my hands on in relation to the mental skills was what I was looking for.
That's so like me, Chris, in as much as I was constantly trying to find information as a young amateur golfer and then professional golfer around the mental side of the game. And I don't know if your experiences were the same, in as much as I was competing with some people who just weren't interested in the mental side, and they were just like, well, I just stand up and I hit the golf ball and I have a bit of a routine and get on with it. I mean, I'm guessing you competed against some people who were probably and slightly for us annoyingly like that. Well, I just stand there and I just bowl the ball down the alley and I get on with it, and there's not much else to it. I assume you were exposed to competitors who were like that.
Oh yeah. If you combine us that are over analytical
Yes,
and those people that don't think about it at all,
yes,
you might have the perfect athlete
somewhere in the
in that
middle.
context, wouldn't you? Yeah.
Yeah.
There's plenty of those people that don't really think about the emotional side or the psychological side of things, which may help them under pressure, but it also even my collegiate bowlers, there were some that just didn't practice or didn't care or whatever, and it was like, geez, what do if you just put in half of the effort that I put in, to the sports or whatever, you'd be much much better than you are. You'd be amazing type thing, and yeah, they just think of it. There's no big deal, and no worry about a mindset in that context, and unfortunately, that's the way some people are until they actually get serious about things, and then they realize that the mental side is a little bit more important.
Mhm.
So yeah, there are people out there that don't really focus on the mental side, and they probably should.
Well, today we're here to talk about a paper you wrote actually a few years ago. I think it's a paper that's 6 years old, and I reached out to you and sort of asked you if you'd come on, and would still like to speak about this paper. But I would suggest that papers like this are pretty timeless because they're so important. And that paper is entitled "Choking Interventions in Sports: A Systematic Review." So it's a review of papers engaging with choking interventions in sport, and your co-author for this is Peter Groppel. So I'm going to be really interested to unpack this. I mean, Chris, I'm assuming this paper stems from your career interest in this area.
Yeah, it is. It's one of the more interesting papers, and it really is relevant to anyone out there who's interested in actually performing better under pressure in that context. So yeah, it does stem from largely from my research, but also Peter actually was the driver of this research, and he asked me to help out in this intervention study, which I think was amazing to do, and I really appreciate him actually inviting me to help out with the paper that he largely did. But I did help out a lot with some of the bits and bops of things. But yeah, he did most of the work, and I'm just giving credit with where credit is due.
So today, basically, we're going to be speaking all things all things choking. We'll define choking, and then we'll talk about all of the interventions that might be involved in helping people deal with or become better at performing under pressure and manage the experiences of choking. I think we'll also dive into into any theories of choking as well. So, looking forward to unpacking this paper. Well, let's begin at the beginning. Let's define some terms. So, choking. The definition of choking.
So choking under pressure, I won't give you a a long sort of winded uh, operational or scientific definition, but I will tell you the elements of choking that we talk about. So, choking under pressure, it's about having some sort of pressure. So, the first thing that one element that needs to be included is this idea of increased anxiety. So, if there's no increased anxiety, choking cannot occur in that respect. So, again, second one might be it has to be done by a skilled performer. So novices won't be able to experience choking, or at least it would be more difficult to determine if choking actually occurred because the variability of the performance for novices, it's just too variable. You don't know if they've increased or decreased their performance because of the anxiety or because they just, well, for lack of a better word, just suck at
Yes.
what they're doing right then,
Yeah.
and then another thing that has to happen is that you have to have some sort of a decreased performance. Now there's a debate at the moment about how much of a decrease in performance people need to have, but in this context, uh, from our perspective or from this podcast perspective, I think people just need to know that there has to be a decrease in performance. And for choking to occur, in large part, it needs to be a relatively substantial decrease in performance, but we won't go into that too much detail. And then Denise Hill probably would argue, one of my researchers and friends, would probably argue that the anxiety needs to be debilitative, which means the anxiety needs to be interpreted as a bad thing rather than a good anxiety being a good thing. Now that is debated in that respect, and I would probably kind of agree with her a bit in relation to people interpreting the anxiety as a negative thing. Probably is probably right, but there's only minimal research to back that up. So we'll just go with the three elements of have to have skilled performance, you have to have a decrease in performance, or skilled performer have to have a decrease in performance, and you have to have an increase in anxiety to have experienced choking in a nutshell.
Can you just dive in just briefly for us? You mentioned debilitative anxiety. What other kinds of experience of anxiety can there be?
So the interpretation of the anxiety
Mm.
is what we're talking about there. So if we're talking about being under pressure and feeling anxiety, if you think that that anxiety is a bad thing, debilitative, then it's likely some of the research suggests that the way you think about it is going to make you perform. So you think about it as a bad thing, and then your performance tends to be more negative, or uh, you know, or you decrease performance in that respect. If you think about anxiety as a good thing, and you feel like it's good for you, then in large part you improve performance in that respect. So again, it just depends on how you think about it. And as Denise would suggest, because there is debilitative anxiety, if people interpret that anxiety as bad, then it's very likely that they're going to have a negative or a decrease in performance. And it's more difficult if someone is thinking about the anxiety as a neutral thing or as positive for them. It's very unlikely that they're going to sort of decrease performance, because that's not usually what happens in a performance setting. So that's what we're talking about in relation to the interpretation.
That's really interesting. So, how we interpret our experience of anxiety can influence whether we choke or not. And so, therefore, it would be remiss of me not to ask you to do a slightly deeper dive into anxiety. I mean, when you talk about anxiety, I know as a sports psychologist, we might think of what might be considered mental anxiety, or the term we might use is cognitive anxiety. When you're talking about anxiety, are you talking about mind and body as well?
Yes, we are talking, like you said, cognitive anxiety, the thinking side of anxiety,
Okay.
things anywhere from, oh my God, my parents are here, I don't want to screw this up, to what will people say about me if I screw this shot up, or if I mess up this shot, or, free throw, or whatever it is. So that's the cognitive side of things. The somatic anxiety, which is the body sensations, are the shaking and the heart rate, the perception of heart rate racing, and those types of things. So yes, we're talking about both of those, the mind and the body, the somatic and the cognitive anxieties that you're describing there.
The somatic being the body,
Correct.
the
Yeah,
feeling.
that's right.
Yeah. And so just briefly dwelling on the standard of performer being a mediator of whether choking occurs or not. It's an interesting one, Chris, because as you're speaking, I'm sitting here thinking of, I don't know, if somebody asked me to walk onto a basketball court and take some free throws, I would be considered a novice at that. I didn't really grow up playing much basketball, and I did that just on my own in a court. I'd be absolutely fine. But if you put several hundred people watching me, I would experience a lot of cognitive thinking anxiety and also somatic feeling anxiety. So I would be a novice, and yet I would consider myself quite capable of choking. But what you're saying is, because I haven't played much basketball, that's not necessarily choking as such.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I'm saying. It would be, what I'm saying there is, it's more difficult to define whether someone actually experiences choking,
Okay.
because the variability of their
Yeah.
performance. So you, in the basketball, on the basketball court, who says it was just that you suck at basketball
Yeah. Yeah. No, I see.
and you just missed the free throws just because you would miss them
Yeah.
anyway, rather than because you were thinking too much or you were anxious or whatever. So, in that context, we're talking about, it's just more difficult to determine if people actually experience choking because of the variability in unskilled performance, or novices. It's just more difficult to determine if they actually experience choking in that respect. But there are some people, some researchers, that suggest that novices can experience choking, but in that context, it's just more difficult to say that they actually have, because of the variability in their performances. Whereas for skilled performers, it's easy to determine that.
Makes absolute sense. In this paper, you start by describing some choking theories before you move on to
Hmm.
the interventions that help people manage themselves in pressure situations. Choking theories, I do find this really, really interesting. Essentially, why and why do we choke? What's happening as we choke? Can you unpack some of these theories? Perhaps we can do a little bit of a dive into some of these theories here.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start off by saying the theories that I'm going to describe are more attention based theories. They focus on where your attention is as a result of anxiety increasing. So let's start with concentration. If you're a skilled performer, most of the time you want to focus on task relevant things. So if you're playing basketball, as an example, and you're doing a free throw, what you're focusing on in that context is to be optimal and to be the best you can. Most of the time, if you're at the free throw line, you're focusing on the baskets, the back of the rim, those types of things, and you're focusing on that specific thing. So task relevant cues, those types of things are important. When anxiety increases, there's two things that researchers suggest that happen. One is that you tend to get distracted, and instead of focusing on those task relevant cues like the basketball rim, you tend to get distracted by other things. So it could be that, I don't know, behind the basket there are fans behind the basket, and because you're anxious, you're more inclined to look at those fans rather than the actual rim itself. So you get distracted by the the fans or any other thing that might distract you. It could be that you
Yeah.
get distracted by your own feelings. You're nervous, so you're shaking a bit, and you're like, "Oh my gosh, I don't. Why am I shaking so much?" That sort of thing. So it could be that. In that context. So that's a distraction model. The self focus models revolve around the skilled performer being too analytical. So at if you know anything about stages of learning and skill development or motor learning, you know that there's three stages: cognitive stage, intermediate stage, and the autonomous stage of skill acquisition. And again, at the autonomous or the expert level, you don't really have to think about the free throws anymore, right? You shouldn't have to think about the free throws. And what some researchers like Rich Masters suggested is that when you're at an expert level, you tend to overanalyze. You tend to think about and regress. We say we reinvest in what we already learned. So at the beginning of our skills, we tend to think about the performance and those types of things. And again, that's what happens when anxiety increases. When we experience choking via the self focus model, we tend to reinvest in those explicit rules that we might have learned at the beginning of our skill acquisition and our development, and we tend to overthink. We Paralysis by analysis is what we kind of say in some of the literature, and that's why choking is experienced in that context, and that's how it is experienced. Is that anxiety increases, and then because that anxiety increases, we tend to shift our attention to internal, and we shift our attention to try to, let's say, be perfect instead of just allowing the body and allowing the most powerful computer in the world, which is your brain, to actually do the skilled performance on its own. And we just override that and try to think too much. And that's the self-focus model.
It would be interesting, given your work, to have a brief reflection back on your 10-pin bowling and what you experienced here. Let me say to you that when I reflect back on my golf, and I experienced at times a huge amount of somatic anxiety, the feelings of shaking, the feelings of the butterflies in my stomach, if you like. And really, I found those so challenging to shift. They would take over. I mean, if we talk, I almost had a little bit of both in terms of the distraction model and the self-focus model. I was distracted by my internal feelings. So my attention shifted inwards, and probably a combination of broad and narrow focus. A broad focus on my shaking body, or so it felt like that, and a narrow focus on the butterflies in my stomach. So sort of a little bit chaotic, really. And then I definitely felt there was almost like a link between that and then a self-focus on, I reinvested back into my technique, because the word I would use is trust. I just dropped in trust. And so it was, I suddenly had 2, 3, 4 swing cues or keys that I had to focus on and to take control of my swing. I stopped trusting what I had and what I practiced. That was my experience. What was yours, Chris?
Well, I think though that's pretty similar. It's interesting you say that because there are some people, researchers that want to combine, they want to combine those two models generally, and I'm kind of, in a way, I'm kind of one of those because I've developed my own theory that's related to the anxiety. Well, going, that's an aside, but going back to your question, from my 10-pin bowling days, I probably would say I had similar ideas to you, and that is because I'm quite analytical. Generally, what I focused on if I got into a pressure situation or an anxiety situation was I actually did focus on the some of the things that I was taught, and that's again that made me internalize, and that made me experience sort of, we'll say, abnormal performance or not so great performance sometimes until I actually figured out how to deal with that, and did a little bit better in that context. I did a lot better, I would say, when I figured out what I was doing and I became aware of what I was doing wrong in some of those situations. So the analytical, the self focus side of it kicked in for me, and I was a bit more analytical when I was bowling in that context.
Yeah, a question I've got, Chris. Sorry to dwell slightly on your temp in bowling, but I think it's always interesting to get the experiences of researchers, academics from their own practical side of things. As a golfer, how this manifested itself so often. The reinvestment then led me to steer and guide shots. I would, as part of distraction as well, then I would get
Mm.
distracted. My inner voice, my thoughts, my ants, if you like, my automatic negative thoughts would go, don't go left, don't go right, don't hit it in the trees. That type of almost cliched things, if we think about it from a golf perspective, because it's something
Yeah.
we speak to all the time. So I would steer and guide. Please get
Mm.
down. If you were to sum up my golf swing in that moment, it's please get down the middle. Please get down the middle. And I suppose this is akin, if I think about other sporting situations where, choking is so prevalent, penalty kicks, the capacity of the professional player to actually get a great strike on that ball. So often they misstrike it and it comes off the boot slower and less accurate, and the goalkeeper just has a little bit more time to make that guess and save the ball, or it misses the goal completely. Did you find in your bowling that you might even get a little bit steery and guidey rather than let it go? I can imagine that's so important, just to let it go.
Yeah, that's a great question in relation to bowling because when you steer and guide, absolutely steer and guide in that respect, but you also in bowling, timing, similar to golf, timing is a really big thing, and a lot of times your accuracy uh, wanes and is disrupted
Yes.
because if you think too much, you slow the thinking process actually slows you down, and because you're thinking, if you think too much, that actually leads to a little bit more rigidity, and you slow things down, and that tends to make you miss your target mainly to the left. So yeah, in that context, I can definitely say that it slows things down and doesn't allow you to trust as much. And like you said, you sort of steer the ball rather than just letting it happen and throw the ball. Yeah, so definitely.
It happens at all levels, and I'll share a brief story here before we move on. A couple of years ago, Phil Mickelson. I mean, you'll know of Phil Mickelson, incredible golfer. Probably top 20 of all time. He won
Mm,
the US PGA at the age of 50 years old, so he became the oldest winner of a major championship in golf. This was a couple of years ago, and
mm,
a great story came out of the final round. He was essentially head to head with Brooks Koepka, who was amassing, it seemed like at the time every major championship he was playing, he was winning. So it was an enormous task for Phil Mickelson in the twilight years of his career. And the first few holes, he wasn't playing very well. He wasn't finding the fairway. He wasn't getting close to the pins, the flags, and so he wasn't giving himself birdie opportunities. And he said afterwards that his caddy, who happens to be his brother caddy for him, I think he still does, on the sixth tee, Brooks Koepka was kind of a neck and neck on score, or Brooks won ahead, or something like that. And as I say, Phil Mickelson really wasn't playing very well, and his brother turned around to him on the sixth tee and said, "Look, hey man, if we're gonna win this tournament, you got to free up. You got to free up. You got to commit to your swing, commit to your shot, free up, and just let it go." And afterwards, Phil Mickelson was regaling this story and said, "Yep, that's precisely what I did." And there were times on the back nine he freed up so much that at the age of 50 there was a couple of times he knocked it past Brooks Koepka. So it really freed up his body, relaxed his muscles, and enabled him to hit the ball a long way, and he ended up winning. But I think, first 6 holes is an example of he was choking in many respects. It was that self-focused model. He was steering and guiding a little bit, and as somebody who you would argue is one of the most experienced competitors, golf being golf, you play to your 60, 65, sometimes even 70. You can compete on the seniors tour. You're not going to get a more experienced competitive sportsman on planet Earth than Phil Mickelson. But here he was, reinvesting. It's just extraordinary.
Anyone can reinvest. Anyone can reinvest in their earlier skills in that respect. So definitely, I can understand that. And you talk about golf. Rory McIlroy in 2011 went from, was it the Masters and then the U.S. Open,
Yes,
or Masters first, and sort of bombed in the Masters, and then 2 months later won the U.S. Open. So. And he learned. I mean, it's not, you're not crippled by this thing called choking. You can learn from it, and it can either be destructive or constructive, either side. So it just depends on who you are and how you learn from the mistake. If you have a mistake of the idea of choking.
It's a really interesting example you bring up there, Chris, because that's possibly one of the most overt demonstrations of somebody who has incredible ability. It's incredible, dare I use this term, talent. Rory McIlroy, and ended up hitting some shots that, to be quite frank, a 15 handicap, 20 handicap would be ashamed of, to caricature it slightly. So it was an extraordinary example that I know a lot of sports sites will use in their lecturing. And I think a really interesting one, and I'm saying these stories as a bit of a neat segue to moving on to what the interventions can look like. Another interesting one could be considered, and I don't want to be unfair on Harry Kane, because Harry Kane is one of the world's best footballers, let's face it. He's been incredible for Spurs, for England, now for Bayern Munich. As we speak now, he's scored 3 goals in his first 2 appearances for his new team. But at the end of last year in the World Cup, playing for England against France, he's the record scorer. He's an incredible footballer, soccer player for England. 2 penalties against France, 2 penalties against a goalkeeper, Hugo Lloris, who actually played for his club team, so somebody he knows very well, which would have potentially messed with his mind, his inner narrative a little bit. And he scored the first one, and the second one he sent careering over the crossbar. And I just, for somebody as skillful as Harry Kane to do what he did, to not even hit the target, that's quite a big deal. And you just wonder what he was saying to himself, especially with that narrative being so mixed, because he's up against the French goalkeeper, Spurs, the former Spurs goalkeeper, Hugo Lloris, so somebody he knew very well. So really interesting example of how an inner narrative can influence attention, distraction, what people focus on, whether they're reinvesting, and so on and so forth. That inner voice matters. And I assume that inner voice plays quite a part in the kind of interventions that you looked at in this paper.
Yeah, the inner voice itself, yeah, definitely. I wouldn't say they're specifically geared toward the inner voice, but certainly, again, this paper itself focused on those 2 models and how we go about changing our either our thoughts or our concentration toward something different. So
take me through that.
Yeah. So you said inner voice, and I'm just going to say most of these interventions aren't specific around the way we talk to ourselves. Some related to self-talk, but these aren't specifically related to self-talk. Although there are studies that look at self-talk and whether people perform better or not under pressure. These aren't focused on those. I'll just give you a little bit of a rundown of some of the things before we talk about the intervention specifically that you need to know. So distraction, as you know, is about where your attention is, and sort of bringing that back. So interventions that focus on the distraction model or try to change someone's or improve performance under pressure via the distraction model, what we need to do is bring them back to the best concentration point.
Gotcha.
And if we're distracted, we want to focus on the what is relevant again. And the only distraction based intervention that at that time, in 2017 or so, when we did the study, that was discussed were pre-performance routines or pre-shot routines in that context. And again, what we know is that pre-shot routines, doing a routine prior to shots or free throws or golf swings, whatever it is, they are actually very beneficial to concentration. And this specifically, this paper showed that they're very focused, and they're very beneficial to concentration and performance under pressure prior to shots. And again, Peter Groppel, actually, if we're going to go into that a little bit more, Peter Groppel and his PhD student recently came out with a meta-analysis that showed that pre-performance routines are very effective for either performance under pressure or just performance generally. So again, he's gone that one more step and said, look, pre-performance routines, whether they're individualized or not individualized, recently said that they're pretty effective in improving performance generally and also under pressure as well. So that gives you an idea of how well these routines are to performance, especially in accuracy-based sports like golf and free throw shooting and those type of things in basketball. So that's just a snapshot of the distraction interventions, and again, that's it. That's the only one that we focused on in that context. If we're talking about the self-focus model, there's a number of different interventions that we can use, and I might need to explain sort of what some of these are when we talk about them. So early on, I used music as a way to distract people from their own thoughts, and that's kind of what a self-focus model is about: being too ingrained with your own thoughts and too over-analytical. So there's a few studies early on that looked at, dual tasks. So for example, asking someone to do arithmetic. So from 100, count backwards by threes while you're performing a basketball free throw. A little bit of distraction. Oh my God, I have to do maths while I'm actually, taking a free throw under pressure. Are you crazy? What's going on with that? So that's a beneficial, at least early on in the choking literature. That was beneficial because all it was doing was distracting people from actually overanalyzing, and that was somewhat beneficial. So what I kind of did in 2008, oh my gosh, that was a long time ago. Now that I say it out loud, I used music as a way to do the same type of thing, but it was just focusing on the words of the music while you're actually doing those free throws or swinging a golf club or whatever you're doing. So and again, the idea is to distract yourself, but music has that innate ability to relax you. And we actually used "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life" from Monty Python.
Nice.
And cognitive restructuring, sort of getting people to relax a bit in that pressure situation. That was quite effective as well. So these dual tasks are somewhat effective, and in this paper, we found that they're somewhat effective as well. But they're not, for the self-focus model, they're not the best intervention to actually use. In our study, a couple of the other interventions are quiet eye training. And quiet eye training is this idea that, if you focus on a target, especially this is mainly in target sports, if you focus on a target for long enough and you fixate your eyes on that target and then perform the task, the longer you fixate on that particular target, the likely and the more accurate that you'll actually be. So, and we can train quiet eye. We can train concentration on a particular target, and that allows us to relax a bit. Maybe not decrease anxiety, but it allows us to focus on what is needed at that particular time. So quiet eye training is another example of an intervention. Now, Peter Groppel, Jürgen Beckman, and myself also looked at left hand ball squeezing, and Peter Groppel and Felix Erlenspiel, all these German colleagues. Jürgen Beckman is a part of that. They all started this trend of basically taking a stress ball in your left hand and squeezing it for 30 seconds before you actually attempt a shot or a task. And what they were arguing was that if you squeeze the stress ball in your left hand, it relaxes different parts of your brain. It kind of allows you to get away from that over analysis of the left side of the brain. It allows you to relax or less stimulation in that left side of the brain, and actually allows you to be more automatic with your skills. So again, that left hand ball squeezing is one that you could use for especially accuracy based sports. Again, 30 seconds all it takes. Maybe 10 seconds it might take 10 seconds, and that's it. And then perform the task under pressure or not. It's somewhat helpful in that context. And again, it's all about decreasing the analytic part of your brain and increasing the more automatic and the more creative side of your brain, and allow things to be more automatic in that context. So again, in that respect, those interventions, if you're tying things into the self-focus and distraction model, those are the main interventions that we looked at and most beneficial. Now, there's one more that I'll mention, and that's simulation training. And that is when you practice under mild anxiety or simulate the pressure. Again, in this particular study, we found that simulation training actually does help performance under pressure as well. So that's not necessarily tied to the two theories or the two models, but simulation training, if you can practice even under mild pressure, take a $5 bill and say, look, let's compete against this, each other, and let's put a $5 on it and see who wins. Then at least that allows you, in my view and other people's view, this was mainly coined by Roel Ottens in the Netherlands. This simulation training stuff, and again, we actually have had a couple studies that have refuted this idea, or at least one study. But so there's a little bit of mixed results, but there's still more results to suggest that it is actually beneficial to practice under pressure, so that you know how to deal with it when you're actually in the real competition. So that's the other sort of intervention that we, in this paper, that suggests, yes, we need to try that as well.
Yeah, we spoke recently on the Sports Psych Show with Associate Professor William Lowe around pressure training. I think it's a really, really interesting area. We talked a lot about the usefulness of adding consequence, and he took us into some of the literature around adding consequence and pressure training. And it feels, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, Chris, but it feels a little bit like these three can go hand in hand, in as much as if a coach engages their participants, their competitors, in any kind of a simulation training, then that might be a useful platform and a useful environment to uncover what participants actually experience. Are they experiencing distraction? Are they engaged in that self-focused model? Are they reinvesting? It feels like if I create the environment where people will experience anxiety, I can also uncover what the tendencies of individual players might be. There's probably not a lot of research on that, but it's just a thought coming back at you there.
No, that's absolutely, I would say that's absolutely spot on in that context. I would say if coaches want to use this information and simulation training especially, they can use that in their practice sessions. Very likely you will learn a hell of a lot in relation to what your athletes do under pressure in a real competition. So if you can simulate that in some way, and again, it could be as simple as putting a $5 note, although some of my research suggests that money is just more of a motivator than it is an anxiety inducer. But again, talking about that sort of thing, or even having other teammates around you, watching you perform, in this simulation environment, that creates some anxiety as well. So if we can simulate that space in a training session, and you can learn from your athletes as a coach in relation to that simulation, then you might be able to either get a sports psych and help help that athlete get better at that, or you can try to give them some strategies to help themselves in that context as well as a coach. So again, that will link to the pressure situation in the real competition as well. Now, with that said, you can never practice what people feel in a real competition. That's not really going to happen. And I think William Lowe is on to something, and his colleagues as well, in relation to trying to determine the best pressure training,
Yes.
if possible. And that's kind of what I kind of like to look at, but I've look at it in a laboratory setting rather than a pressure training setting. But the idea there is to put as much pressure on them as possible in a practice situation, so we can then see how they're going to be in a real world competition, which is where you're going to see some real improvements. But the idea there is to make the athlete, or at least you, become aware of that person's predispositions or what they will do in a mild anxiety situation, so that you can say, look, it's going to be magnified by 10 in a real world competition. I'm just giving a brief idea of magnified by 10. There's just pulling numbers out of my butt in relation to that. But again, it's going to be magnified in a real world competition. And it's important to get the athlete aware of how they actually deal with that pressure, that lower pressure, before they get into the real world competition in that context.
One thing I wanted to ask you, I mean, as we get to the end of this conversation, you mentioned that you have your own thoughts, your own theory around choking. We've talked about the distraction model. We talked about the self-focus model. I know this isn't specifically related to this paper, but is there anything that you can share with us with regard to your own thoughts to choking?
Well, I'll say that my my theory relates and links to these models, but as I said at the beginning, sort of when we were talking about the models, the models themselves are related to attention.
Mm,
And my theory that I'm trying to continue to develop is, why does anxiety increase in the first place? And a lot of this theory comes back to Mark Leary and Roy Baumeister, who talks about um, you having self-presentation concerns. And what I mean by that is really thinking about and trying to behave in a way that will impress other people, as an example. And no one wants to be, labeled a choker. So what I feel like happens is that people want to sort of impress other people, and that anxiety comes from social anxiety. And sport is a perfect example of where social anxiety develops, because if you don't perform well as an athlete under pressure, you labeled a choker, that's probably the worst thing ever for an athlete to be labeled, because the ultimate goal of an athlete is to be able to perform under pressure. And if you're labeled a choker, that just draws negative consequences and negative attention to you. So my theory basically suggests that anxiety increases because people tend to want to provide a positive impression, and their focus then turns toward themselves, and they try to make that positive impression by either um, becoming more internal via the self-focus model, and they try to make things happen, which then is counterproductive, or they just become distracted by all of the other uh, things that are around them, as I said before in the distraction model, and that really is where the negative performance comes from. Is I think it's the anxiety starts, and then all of these worries and concerns about other people, social anxiety, then lead to those distraction, those models of choking in that context. So I really, it's interesting you asked that question, because I feel like, I could talk all day about this. I feel like sometimes we're not getting it at the moment. We're not getting what we need to focus on within the choking literature, and that is, why do people get anxious in the first place? That leads to, you can't have choking without anxiety, right? So, why do people get anxious in the first place? And that's where I came up with this self-presentation model of choking.
It's really, really interesting, Chris. I was writing a few things down as you were speaking there. I wrote down social dimension, in as much as you're suggesting that there's a social dimension to our experience of anxiety. I have definitely in my own practice. So as you were speaking, I was thinking about practice at the coalface in my own practice, talking so much more to coaches about when I refer to anxiety. It's very interesting that you're talking about this, because I talk so much to coaches now about social anxiety, that most of the anxieties that I believe that athletes are experiencing are exactly what you're speaking to, a sense of social anxiety. It was really interesting to hear you say, I mean, another term I wrote down was impression management, that essentially athletes are engaged in impression management all the time. And again, I think you can go from the participative level right the way through to the adult elite competitive level, which is the professional level. I always remember one coach many, many years ago, a training day I went to, and it was a golf coach, a very experienced golf coach who had worked for many years with various sports psychologists. And this golf coach wrote up on the board WWPTOM, WWPTOM, which turns out is basically an acronym for "What will people think of me?" What will people think of me? And this coach basically saying he felt the vast majority of it, basically to speak to what you've said, the vast majority of golfers are experiencing this because they have, whether it's a conscious or an unconscious bias towards caring about what other people think of them. And it even makes me think of my conversation I had with Dr. Dan McAdams from Northwestern University, one of the world's leading researchers on personality science, and basically personality exists. All of our experiences, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions that makes up our behavior, our personality, day to day, moment to moment, if you like, is driven by getting along and getting ahead. So you could even, and maybe I'm playing with the idea here, even suggest that the experience people have on the pitch, on the court, on the course, is influenced by their conscious and subconscious bias around want to get along, want to get ahead, got to do well here, don't want to look stupid. Just a bunch of thoughts thrown back at you with relation to what you said. And I think the final thing to reflect back to you, because I'd be interested to get your thought here, is again, what you're saying really matters to somebody like myself as a sports psychology consultant at the coalface, because it does make a difference to how I'm intervening. Not just from a technique perspective, but the conversations I'm starting, the kind of questions I'm asking. And if I have a lens of the world where I'm considering so much of this is due to social anxiety, it makes a difference to the kind of questions I'm asking, the kind of conversations I'm having with competitors. No question, just some thoughts back at you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've said it a few times in my papers. If the self-presentation model is the reason for people choking, then these interventions that Peter Groppel and I have looked at might be band aid fixes for the social anxiety or the social anxiety disorders or mental health disorders or, fear related disorders that people that experience choking might be having. So, again, I've said that a few times in my papers, and I really do think that there needs to be, outside of these interventions, there needs to be more research done on, maybe psychological approaches that might be able to reduce choking from those people that are having these really bad choking experiences because of social anxiety disorders or other things rather than just attention based issues. And some of our recent research, actually, if I may go off topic from our paper, is some of our recent research is actually looking at the mental health of athletes that experience choking generally. And we found that elite athletes or more experienced athletes are more adversely affected by choking experiences than, let's say, recreational athletes because they have more invested in their experiences. So they do things, and this is not a single thing. Denise Hill probably came up with this idea before we did, but she said in some of her qualitative research, she said that some of her golfers that she interviewed actually were suicidal or did drunk driving because they wanted to get away from the choking experience or even the choking label. So we really do have to think about more than just the attention based information with these athletes. And, the sports psychology consultant becomes really, really important
Mm.
if they know someone has experienced choking because these athletes may be vulnerable to some of these really, detrimental mental health issues.
And I think everything you're speaking to there is it sounds to me like the great work you're doing behind the scenes with Peter, trying to gain some empirical findings here around the relationship between mental health and choking. Again, so much of what you're saying resonates with me in terms of how, at least but I know others are trying to intervene in this area with athletes. I come back to that idea of narrative, that the daily narrative that athletes have around their performance, whether it's the importance of performance and the meaning of performance, performance with relation to their identity, performance with relation to their relationships, performance with relation to their day-to-day life and functioning, and what they're doing in sport and outside of sport, and their place in their team, the club, the organization they play for. All these things matter. And so, what I find in my work is, and again, I'm speaking to other sports psychologists who work at the coalface, I know it's not dissimilar to them, is that so much of our work is broadening out mental skills. If we think of some of the mental skills with relation to what we've been talking about, the techniques, if you like, the routine, the attention control, the self-talk, the cues, that stuff is important, but it becomes arguably becomes a band-aid if they're isolated. However, if you're doing them and
Mm.
you're relating them to um, goal achievement theory, and you're relating them to broader ideas around personal identity, and perhaps more sophisticated meanings of competition in our day-to-day life. I know we had Kath Bishop on, who's not a sports psychologist but has written widely about helping athletes, the promotion of developing broader and deeper meanings around participation in sport. Lawrence Halstead, as well, former Olympian, is doing great work in this area, just changing meaning, and even the introduction of positive psychologies into this thriving and flourishing. We've spoken to Dr. Dan Brown on this a couple of times. We've had some great guests talking about meaning and narrative here. I think it's all thrown into the mix, but what I like about what you're saying is almost a little bit of a gel here, bringing it all together, is this idea of actually, let's think about anxiety in sport being related to, the primary anxiety being social anxiety. What will people think of me? My place in society? What this impression management, if you like.
Mm.
I think it's hierarchically, it's interesting as to where that can sit. That can be a real glue stick, if you like, in terms of how we make sense of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're hitting the nail on the head in relation to the self-presentation model.
Mm.
You're talking about athlete identity or athletic identity and those types of things. That's where I sort of, I geared some of the ideas in relation to that model around is that athletic identity and what do I do if I'm a choker? As an example, if I'm an athlete only, if I'm exclusively an athlete and I actually experience choking, then who am I? I'm not really anyone, am I? Because I can't perform under pressure type thing. So it's another reason why I kind of linked the mental health side of things to this choking idea, because really, if someone is exclusively an athlete, it's somewhat likely that they will, if they experience choking, they might have harsher mental health issues or potentially likely go toward the depression side or things like that if they only have an athlete as their identity and very exclusively as their identity. So, yeah, very interesting ideas in relation to being an athlete and choking. I feel like there's more research to come in relation to how choking links to mental health related issues. It's a really interesting topic, and I think we're only at the start of that conversation.
Great stuff. To close things out, Chris, I mean, we've got coaches listening in. Well, we've certainly got competitors themselves listening in. We've got sports psychologists listening in and people who are involved in sports on a day-to-day basis. I'd love to get from you a reflection on what we've spoken about in the shape of sort of 2 to 3 hints, tips, sort of summary sentences, if you like, that you think are great takeaways for those listening in.
Wow, that's a fantastic question. Um, the first, I think the first take is trust what you have learned. So you said earlier, trust, in your golf game, trust just went out the window. Well,
Yes.
somehow trust what you've learned and know that you can do it. That's the first thing, and it's not even one of the interventions that we talk about. The second thing is become aware that when or if you experience choking, become aware that your attention shifts when anxiety increases.
Love that.
And if you can become aware of what you do, then you can use one of these interventions within the intervention study that we did. And if you know exactly which model you fit into, you can use a pre-performance routine or a pre-shot routine if you're distracted, or you can use any one of the other interventions to help you stop over analyzing things with your swing or with your performance themselves. So I think those are the two main messages. And if I were to say a last one, I would say in relation to anxiety and choking generally is if you experience choking, there are ways out of it, and you can come back from choking no matter what. It's not the end of the world, and it could be just the beginning of your better performances under pressure. So again, becoming aware and knowing why are the first steps in improving and being clutch under pressure.
Fantastic. Chris, great. great tips, great hints, a great summary of what we've spoken about today. Chris, I can't thank you enough for your time. I know that everybody listening in will be interested to find you, follow you, and learn more about your work and potentially get hold of the paper that we've spoken about today. So how can people achieve all three things?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, or X as they call it now. My handle is at C Mesagno, Mesagno. That's my handle. Or you can just look up Chris Mesagno or Christopher Mesagno on Twitter. You'll probably be able to find me. Please follow if you want to do so. And the paper that we're speaking of is on the International Review of Sport and Exercise Psychology website. Feel free, it is open access to anyone. Feel free to download that paper if you'd like to read it. At the moment, and hopefully this will help, at the moment it's the number one most read on that journal website, which I'm very
Wow.
Peter Gruppel and I are very appreciative of whoever is downloading that paper, and I assure you it's not just me and my mom. More reading that and downloading as much as we possibly can, but certainly being used by other people. And if I may, I would also like to say thank you very much for having me. I'm very appreciative of being on such a prolific podcast that has a number of very high quality researchers and also practitioners on it. I've looked back at some of the podcasts and listened to some, and being in the spotlight with other amazing people I'm very appreciative for. So really appreciate you having me on today.
Appreciate you coming on and taking the time, Chris. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks very much.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.